Who has the right to divide the earth? Not the right to travel across it, not the right to explore its coasts or map its oceans, but the authority to decide which part of it belongs to whom. In 1494, two European kingdoms, Spain and Portugal, claimed that authority. They agreed to draw a line across the Atlantic Ocean. Everything west of that invisible boundary would fall within the Spanish sphere. Everything east would belong to Portugal. The line ran through waters that were still poorly understood. It cut across lands already inhabited by millions of people. None of those people were present at the negotiation. And yet, within the political imagination of the late 15th century, the agreement did not appear absurd. It appeared orderly. It appeared structured. For decades, Portugal had been exploring the African coast, searching for a maritime route to Asia. Spain, newly unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, sought its own path to wealth and influence. When Christopher Columbus sailed west in 1492, he did not realize that he had reached lands unknown to Europeans. But his voyage shifted the balance between the two crowns. The Atlantic was no longer distant. It became a corridor of possibility, and possibility brought risk. Both kingdoms understood that rivalry at sea could escalate into open conflict. War between Christian powers was costly and unpredictable. Division offered something different. A negotiated boundary promised stability. The agreement that followed became known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. On the surface, it looked like a diplomatic compromise, two rivals attempting to prevent confrontation. But beneath that surface lay a more consequential assumption. The treaty rested on the idea that territory could be claimed before it was fully known, that distant lands could be assigned through negotiation conducted in Europe. That recognition between powerful states was sufficient to render such claims legitimate. The arrangement carried papal support, which gave it religious weight. In the moral framework of the time, political authority and divine sanction were intertwined. Dividing the world was not framed as arbitrary seizure. It was presented as the extension of a recognized order into newly encountered spaces. That is what makes this moment significant. The treaty did not simply divide territory, it revealed a transformation in thought. The planet became something measurable, negotiable, partitionable, a space that could be organized through abstraction before it was understood through experience. Once that way of thinking takes hold, expansion becomes easier to justify. Control becomes easier to explain. Distance no longer weakens authority. It becomes something that can be managed on parchment. This episode is not about ships or navigation techniques. It is about legitimacy. It asks how two kingdoms came to believe they possessed the authority to structure lands they had never seen. It asks why that belief appeared coherent within their own system of recognition. And it asks whether the logic behind that division, the assumption that powerful states can shape global space through mutual agreement, still echoes in modern geopolitics. To understand why the Treaty of Tordesillas appeared acceptable in 1494, we must first understand how authority functioned in the late 15th century. Because Europe was not yet organized as a system of equal sovereign states, each legally identical and independent. That framework belongs to a later era. In the late Middle Ages, political legitimacy was deeply intertwined with religion. Authority did not operate separately from faith, it was reinforced by it. The Pope was not merely a spiritual figure, he was widely regarded as a moral arbiter within Christendom. His recognition could strengthen a ruler's claim, his disapproval could weaken it. Divine sanction and political order were understood as connected. Christian monarchs did not see themselves as isolated actors competing in a neutral arena. They belonged to a shared religious hierarchy. That hierarchy provided structure. It defined who was considered part of the legitimate political world and who stood outside it. When disputes arose between kingdoms, papal mediation was not extraordinary. It was a recognized mechanism within that order. Arbitration under religious authority offered not only a diplomatic solution, but a moral one. In the decades before 1494, Portugal had already received papal authorization to explore along the African coast. These authorizations came in the form of papal bulls, formal decrees granting Portugal exclusive rights over territories it might encounter during its voyages. A papal bull carried both legal and spiritual significance. It signaled that expansion was not merely permitted by a crown. It was sanctioned within the broader Christian hierarchy. This precedent mattered. If the Pope could validate Portuguese claims along the African coast, he could also validate Spanish claims across the Atlantic. When Christopher Columbus returned from his voyage in 1492, Spain suddenly possessed discoveries that disrupted the existing balance. The Atlantic was no longer distant speculation. It was a zone of competition. Two ambitious kingdoms now faced the possibility of overlapping claims. Conflict was possible, but open war between Christian powers was costly and unpredictable. Negotiation under shared religious authority offered a different path. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued papal bulls that supported Spanish claims west of a designated line. Spain and Portugal then negotiated directly, adjusting that line through the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. From a modern perspective, it may seem astonishing that a religious authority could influence the division of entire continents. But within the political imagination of the time, this was not extraordinary. Divine sanction and political recognition were inseparable. Authority did not rest solely on force. It rested on acknowledgement within a shared moral structure. There was also a deeper assumption beneath the treaty. European rulers believed that lands not governed by Christian monarchs could be incorporated into a Christian political framework. This did not mean they believed such lands were empty. It meant they did not regard existing political structures as equal participants in their own system of legitimacy. The world, in their view, was not composed of equal nations. It was layered. At the top stood Christian rulers bound together by faith and mutual recognition. Beneath them were territories seen as available for incorporation, conversion, or governance. The treaty reflected this hierarchical worldview. It assumed that negotiation between recognized Christian powers was sufficient to determine rightful control over distant lands. Recognition among the powerful was treated as enough. Consultation with the inhabitants of those territories was not considered necessary within that framework. From inside that system of thought, the division of the world did not appear chaotic. It appeared ordered. It appeared consistent with the moral and political logic of the time. Understanding this does not excuse what followed, but it explains how such a decision could be made without appearing outrageous to those who signed it. The treaty was not just an act of ambition. It was the expression of a worldview in which authority flowed downward from divine sanction and outward through recognized power. The Treaty of Tordesillas did not simply confirm a papal decision, it modified it. The original line proposed in 1493 favored Spain. It was drawn relatively close to the Atlantic islands, securing Spanish advantage in newly encountered territories. Portugal, however, was not satisfied. Decades of maritime exploration had given the Portuguese crown both experience and caution. Their navigators understood how little was truly known about the Atlantic's full expanse. A boundary drawn too narrowly could restrict future discovery. Negotiations followed. In 1494, representatives of Spain and Portugal met in the town of Tordesillas. They agreed to move the dividing line farther west, approximately 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. At the time, No one knew precisely what lay beyond that adjustment. The ocean remained vast. Maps were incomplete. Measurement itself was uncertain. But the movement of the line mattered. An abstract calculation on parchment quietly reshaped the future geography of continents neither side fully understood. The treaty did not redraw visible borders. It redrew possibility. In 1500, a Portuguese expedition led by Pedro Álvares Cabral reached the coast of what would later be called Brazil. Because the dividing line had been shifted westward, that land fell within Portugal's recognized sphere of influence. What might have become a Spanish possession instead developed under Portuguese control. The negotiators in Tordesillas could not have predicted this outcome in detail, yet their decision created the legal framework that made it possible. Recognition preceded occupation. Diplomatic agreement preceded settlement. Legal abstraction preceded physical control. This sequence is crucial. The treaty established that expansion did not need to begin with conquest. It could begin with recognition among powerful states. Once agreement existed, exploration could proceed with confidence that rivalry had already been structured. The consequences were not immediate in every case. Colonization unfolded gradually. Settlement expanded unevenly. But over time, the line drawn in 1494 produced a lasting cultural divide. Language followed power. Portuguese became dominant in Brazil. Spanish spread across much of the rest of the Americas. A decision negotiated in a European town shaped the linguistic landscape of an entire continent. The effects extended beyond language. Administrative systems developed differently. Trade networks diverged. Patterns of land distribution and economic organization took distinct forms in Portuguese and Spanish territories. Brazil evolved under colonial structures that would later influence its political development and regional identity in ways that distinguished it from its neighbors. All of this traced back to a line that began as measurement rather than conquest. The treaty did not prevent future conflicts, nor did it determine every boundary with precision, but it created a framework within which expansion unfolded. It transformed rivalry into order, it allowed ambition to operate within agreed limits, and it demonstrated that European powers believed they could structure global space through negotiation alone. There was another consequence, less visible but equally profound. By treating distant lands as divisible through agreement, the treaty normalized a method of organizing the world that would reappear in later centuries. The language would change, the actors would change, but the principle would remain recognizable. Power could define spheres. Recognition among the powerful could stabilize competition, and decisions made in one part of the world could structure realities in another. The Treaty of Tordesillas did not invent empire, but it formalized a logic that made empire easier to administer. It suggested that the world itself could be partitioned before it was fully understood, that geography could be negotiated in advance of presence. That distance did not weaken authority, it simply required coordination. This shift did not end in 1494. It became part of the architecture of modern international order. What began as a line on parchment became a durable method of organizing space. And once space can be organized abstractly, power can expand with fewer immediate obstacles because the conflict has already been decided in principle. That was the quiet mechanism at work. Not spectacle, not dramatic conquest, but structured agreement shaping the future before the future arrived. The Treaty of Tordesillas did more than prevent conflict between two kingdoms. It altered how political order could be imagined on a global scale. Before the late 15th century, European power expanded gradually, often through proximity. Territory was acquired through dynastic inheritance warfare between neighbors, or incremental frontier movement, authority grew outward from known centers. Tordesillas introduced something different. It treated distant space as divisible in advance. Geography no longer needed to be fully understood before it could be structured. Political order could precede physical presence. This shift was subtle, but profound. The treaty assumed that the earth could be organized through abstraction. A line drawn in negotiation became a framework for future action. Exploration did not begin from uncertainty alone. It began from agreement. This changed the relationship between knowledge and power. Previously, expansion followed discovery. Now, discovery unfolded within a prearranged structure. The unknown was no longer entirely open. It was already partitioned in principle. That alteration reshaped how European states approached global ambition. Space became something that could be measured before it was inhabited, claimed before it was governed, assigned before it was encountered. The act of dividing the Atlantic was therefore not only diplomatic, it was conceptual. It signaled confidence that political authority could extend across distance without immediate enforcement. Recognition replaced proximity. If two recognized powers agreed on a boundary, that boundary gained legitimacy within their system, even if it had no physical marker on the ground. Agreement itself became a stabilizing mechanism. This reduced the likelihood of direct rivalry between Spain and Portugal, but it also normalized a method of organizing the world through selective recognition. Political order no longer depended solely on occupation. It depended on acknowledgement among those considered legitimate participants. That logic had long-term implications. It encouraged expansion to unfold within defined spheres rather than open competition. It allowed rival powers to structure ambition without constant confrontation, and it reinforced the idea that the world could be managed through coordination among the powerful. At the same time, the treaty revealed a limitation embedded in that structure, because recognition operated within a closed circle. The inhabitants of the lands affected by the agreement were not included in its formation. Their political systems were not consulted. Their authority was not treated as equivalent within the negotiating framework. This exclusion was not incidental. It was structural. The treaty assumed that legitimacy flowed horizontally among recognized Christian rulers and vertically downward into territories they incorporated. It did not flow outward toward those outside the circle of acknowledgement. As a result, global order began to form around layered participation. Some actors negotiated, others were negotiated over. This layering did not immediately destabilize Europe. In fact, it stabilized relations between Spain and Portugal, but it embedded a pattern in which stability at the center could coexist with transformation at the margins. The consequences of this pattern unfolded gradually. Administrative systems developed along the lines established by recognition. Cultural divisions solidified. Economic structures adapted to spheres of influence that had first existed only as abstraction. Over time, what began as a diplomatic solution became a durable feature of political organization. The Treaty of Tordesillas demonstrated that global space could be structured through agreement before it was fully known. It revealed that authority could extend beyond direct control when recognition among the powerful was considered sufficient. This did not eliminate conflict. It did not guarantee justice, but it provided a method for managing expansion within a shared framework. In doing so, it transformed the scale at which political order could operate. The world was no longer simply encountered. It was arranged. The Treaty of Tordesillas forces a distinction that remains central to political order: the difference between power and legitimacy. Power is the capacity to act, to command, to enforce. Legitimacy is the reason that action is accepted as rightful. In 1494, Spain and Portugal clearly possessed power. They commanded ships, armies, wealth, and recognition within Christendom. They could project force across oceans, but the treaty did not rely on force alone. It relied on mutual acknowledgement. Recognition between the two crowns transformed power into structured authority. This is the mechanism at the heart of the agreement. Spain recognized Portugal's sphere. Portugal recognized Spain's. That reciprocal recognition stabilized competition. It reduced uncertainty. It converted rivalry into order. Within their shared framework, the arrangement was legitimate, but legitimacy operated inside a defined circle. The treaty did not seek universal consent. It sought recognition among those considered qualified to grant it. Authority flowed horizontally between acknowledged powers and vertically into territories they incorporated. It did not extend outward toward those excluded from participation. This reveals a layered model of legitimacy. Internally, the agreement was coherent. It satisfied the expectations of rulers who understood themselves as part of a shared moral hierarchy. Externally, it imposed consequences on societies that were not recognized as equal actors in that hierarchy. The distinction matters. An agreement can produce stability without producing justice. It can organize power effectively while leaving entire populations outside its definition of legitimacy. The Treaty of Tordesillas demonstrates how political systems often operate through selective recognition. Those who are acknowledged shape order. Those who are not acknowledged experience its effects without influencing its formation. This mechanism is not unique to the 15th century. It reflects a broader pattern in how authority consolidates itself. When power is mutually recognized among dominant actors, it acquires a presumption of legitimacy. It becomes easier to defend, easier to explain, easier to maintain. But legitimacy built on closed recognition remains fragile in a different way, because it depends on agreement within the circle more than consent beyond it. If recognition inside the system holds, stability follows. If recognition fractures, order weakens. Those outside the circle rarely determine the system's durability. Those within it do. This is why the treaty succeeded in preventing war between Spain and Portugal. The circle remained intact. Mutual acknowledgement endured. Stability at the center was preserved. Yet that stability coexisted with transformation at the margins. The inhabitants of the Americas were not treated as sovereign participants in the negotiation. Their political realities were not erased physically, but they were bypassed diplomatically. Their exclusion was not incidental. It was foundational to how the agreement functioned. The treaty therefore illustrates two overlapping truths. First, political order often depends on recognition among those with power. Second, legitimacy defined too narrowly can generate consequences that extend far beyond the circle that created it. The agreement did not collapse because it lacked force. It endured because it possessed recognition within its system. But endurance within a closed framework does not resolve the broader question: who counts when order is defined? And how wide must recognition extend before legitimacy becomes more than stability? The Treaty of Tordesillas does not answer those questions definitively. It exposes them. It shows that power can structure the world through agreement. It also shows that legitimacy depends on who is permitted to participate in that agreement. When recognition is narrow, order can still be stable, but stability achieved within a closed circle always carries consequences beyond it. In 1494, in the town of Tordesillas, a line was agreed upon that neither side could fully visualize. The ink dried quietly. There was no spectacle. No armies moved that day. Yet something significant had shifted. The Treaty of Tordesillas was not a moment of conquest. It was a moment of definition. Two kingdoms sought stability. They sought to prevent conflict. And in doing so, they demonstrated confidence that political order could extend across oceans through agreement alone. The significance of that decision does not lie only in the territories that followed. It lies in the logic it expressed. Confidence that the world could be structured before it was fully known. Confidence that recognition among the powerful was sufficient to define legitimacy. Confidence that distance did not weaken authority, but merely required coordination. That confidence marked a turning point in how global space was imagined. The Earth was no longer simply encountered, it was organized in principle. Borders could exist in abstraction before they existed on land. Spheres of influence could be acknowledged before they were enforced. Political order could be negotiated in advance of presence. The line drawn across the Atlantic would fade in practical precision over time. Empires shifted, borders changed, new doctrines of sovereignty emerged, yet the underlying method endured. Power could stabilize competition through mutual acknowledgement. Global order could be shaped by those recognized as entitled to negotiate it. The treaty did not invent hierarchy. It revealed it at planetary scale. It exposed how legitimacy can function within a defined circle while excluding others from participation. It showed how stability at the center can coexist with transformation at the margins. More than 5 centuries later, it remains significant not because of the exact placement of a boundary, but because of what that boundary represented. Not only who had the power to divide the earth, but who was permitted to participate in that decision, and whether agreement at the center is enough to justify the order beyond it. The treaty does not offer a simple moral lesson. It offers a question, not only who has the right to divide the earth, but why that authority should belong to anyone at all.